which is all about building collaboration, in particular utilising assurance and an expanded definition of assurance based on bringing in diverse voices than maybe what we would typically include as part of standards development processes. So, as we've heard from our introductory processes, we're living in quite a transformational time for our project management industries, our organisational settings, and for me, implementing artificial intelligence is simply not another tech project. It's multi-layered, gets to the bottom of the concept of, well, what does this mean for the human's place in typical work tasks? And so for me, as part of my doctoral research that I completed at the University of the Sunshine Coast in 2022, I particularly wanted to work out what end users perceive to be the changes. I also wanted to make sure that I could actually set all my research in a distant context. So I commenced my doctoral research in 2017, and what I found was that I needed to use futures and strategic foresight research methodologies to start to stretch people's thinking processes. And so for me, I set all of my doctoral research in a 20-year planning horizon around 2040. And for me in particular, it's making sure that we start to get ourselves as project managers and researchers not only familiar with the current time, but also assist organisations, governments, policymakers with anticipating what the future could actually look like. So for me, my published research described organisations on the future on a continuum of different operating models. This is an example of those. The continuum of those went from a human-centred operating model where organisations of the future, remembering I'm setting all my research 20 years in the future as opposed to today, we might have parts of our organisation that are purely human on one end of the scale. What we might also find though, as organisations evolve, and this is starting to occur, is that there might be unique operating models within our organisational structures that are machine only, machine-led, machine-determined. And so it's the other end of the continuum. Where we're at now, in many circumstances, is this concept more of a hybrid type organisational context where we need to determine what the right human to AI ratio is. For our organisational context, and determining first of all what are the things that we know AI could do for us, but what are the things and parts of our organisation, culture, context, process, customer experience that we do not want to erode. So I had some unanswered questions at the end of my doctoral research, like all good researchers then I know exploring alternate and new forms of other questions, a bit like what our Professor Pinto talked about this morning. One of those questions are, what are the opportunities and threats from AI use that we see both now and in the longer term? The second question, but what do we not want AI to do or erode in our communities or our organisations, both now and in the longer term? But in particular, who will decide that? Who will decide that? Will it be the developers? Will it be the leaders of organisations? Will it be the community members? Will those diverse voices actually be heard? Or will it actually be AI itself starting to determine who potentially will not and do certain items? So this was what prompted me to sort of expand on my doctoral research, and why this was relevant, because people are paying attention. You know, back in early 2022, we saw ChatGPT sort of explode into organisational contexts. We saw school children starting to utilise it, and teachers, university professors, a range of people were suddenly going, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this? So people are actually starting to pay attention. People are also, from what their research is, the stories that they're starting to hear in their community or from the media that they actually start to get access to, are realising that the parameters and algorithms can be flawed or biased in their application. We hear more lessons learned than failures often. Well, we don't hear the successes as much. We hear the doom and gloom. In Australia, we had a couple of classic examples over the last 18 months apart from some significant sort of cyber incidents, we also had what's called the robo-debt scandal, which is something that affected quite a lot of people in Australia, and there's criminal proceedings starting. It was a government initiative, and the AI provided some wrong information to those people receiving social security benefits, and actually caused harm to some of those people. So we also are trying to trust. So we've just heard our really fantastic initial research from my colleague over here about we want to trust the developers, we want to trust the corporations. And so we've got to, at the moment, given that we've got a bit of a regulatory void, we've got to trust that corporations developing AI and using AI are actually doing the right thing. So we've got this unique sort of position at the moment, and for us as project managers, when I was starting to think about this, I was thinking, well, surely the concept of assurance, quality validation could play a role here, but we needed to expand it. So we all know from a project perspective that assurance is one of those pretty important ways that we can determine whether or not the delivery confidence is valid throughout the life of a project, that we can feel that the business value is likely to be provided. We also know that assurance typically looks at adherence to process, to practice, to good practice, and usually involves a group of independent or impartial people. So some assurance methodologies, such as gateway review, for example, they also talk about this notion of 3 lines of defence. So we're making the assumption that as researchers, we're very familiar with the concept of assurance and how it is often a risk-based application in organisational settings. The authors and the authors of the standards that we typically use as part of assurance processes usually are consultants, they're academics potentially, they're representatives of industry, or they may be advanced technology practitioners. And my original degree was social science, so I'm a very strong advocate for making sure that when we're making decisions that we think not only of the end profit line, if we're in a for-profit company, but also make sure that we are considering the impact on the end user who may be a vulnerable community member. So I started thinking the research question, which is part of the paper that I submitted for this particular conference, is can a genuine end user voice be included in assurance of AI initiatives? When in reality, we know now that more human-centered transformation processes are often constrained. I do a lot of work in the organisational change management context. Adaptation is something that I've loved for a long time. Used to be on the global board for the Change Management Institute. And what we see in many, many organisations is that sometimes that sort of desire to do human-based and human-centred related work is eroded due to other constraints. And so for me, I'm thinking, well, how are we going to make sure that we hear the voices of those people who currently are voiceless, or the voices of people who at the moment are just in that position where they're trying to trust that these systems are going to be for the good of humanity and the planet, as opposed to just be good for big business. Can you give me a 5-minute mark? Yeah, thank you. So my original research was expanded. So I originally had 110 participants in 3 workshops in Australian and international contexts. And I used that 2040 planning horizon and developed, as part of that process for my research, a number of muses that I had participants be part of. And the published research expands on this work. So the personas that came through are typical personas that we'd like to think of: a customer or an individual perspective, employee, decision maker, but then we also had AI being specifically mentioned. We utilised these personas in the context of user stories from agile-based project management disciplines. So as a customer, as artificial intelligence, what do I want to do, what do I not want to do, which is a typical way that we determine functional requirements and features if we're using agile as part of our project delivery methodology. That expanded on those user stories from the base raw material that was provided, and came through with just a few examples highlighted. So as a community member, This is directly from participants as part of my research process. I wanted to honour the voice of the participant in this process, that we want AI to be checked for morality and human values before deployment. Interestingly, the human participants as part of my research also included AI as a persona. They gave it an entity, and the AI itself, as part of their process, said, I understand that humans are not algorithms. So it was quite good when you actually play with futures and foresight methodologies. It's an opportunity to open and expand your mind, open and expand your thinking. And it's certainly something for me, prompted us to generate as a cohort of people some guiding principles. So these guiding principles that were originally published were interestingly, given that they were user generated, were quite aligned with, at the time, some of the sort of early work around ethical standards that was starting to emerge through institutional entities. So these items were things such as bias-free decision-making and human accountability, process and interface efficiency, ethical function and transition. And for me, when I was working through my research on these guiding principles, I wanted to utilise these as part of portfolio-based decision-making processes. So when we're actually determining the validity of whether or not we want to invest in certain AI processes or AI projects, add some of these particular parameters to the list, rather than just go, what's the value, what's the benefits realisation, what's the ROI, etc. We want to sort of determine, well, from a decision-making process, how much of this AI system will maintain human dignity and empathy in decisions. Especially imagine, and I use my mum all the time in my presentations, my mum Dorothy's 81, and I was thinking, if she needs to go into an aged care setting in the future, I could have a robot provide her with her medication. But do I want to? Do I want to erode that warm touch, the warm smile of someone providing that medication? And so it got me thinking more and more about, I want to make sure that this information can be turned into something that then can be used to inform decisions, but become user-generated assurance criteria. And so the process itself was taking the guiding principles that had been created, which had been validated by people and have been quoted in a number of different papers since that original research, work with a number of different organisations on AI-related projects to play with this concept. And so the research describes the workshop process that I undertook to take the guiding principles, turn them into areas of exploration about what would be, from a user voice, the key checks, tests and balances, and to come up with what would be considered, for many people, raw assurance criteria. That raw assurance criteria then could be taken, if necessary, formalised with evidence, and I've tested it so far on 9 different AI initiatives. And then it's a review and repeat type process. So in particular, within those 9 different organisational entities, context was going to vary the workshop process. So for me, context is the queen of the process. We really need to adapt, like what we do for our project delivery methodologies. We adapt and change our approach based on the context. For me, it was delivery maturity, their view on customer or client type, as well as their expected AI use, knowing that not all organisations will determine to automate everything, even if they could, and also the scale of that AI investment and the risks that were actually involved. So some of the examples, and I chose to bring forth the example from a non-profit or charitable sector client that I have so far prototyped this workshop process and assurance, user-generated assurance, and I thought I'd just show you a couple of examples within the time restraints that I have. First of all, one of those base guiding principles, safety of humans. This is what the raw assurance criteria was from my client. You can see the language is quite different. Show me how AI keeps me safe and secure, making sure I'm protected from any harm or worries. This is not standard language in terms of assurance criteria. But this came from the voice of people who were going to not only use AI, but potentially have decisions made that would affect them. And so it's thinking from the end user, what would your mum would say, what your sister would say, what your colleague would say, not what an academic would say. What would you say? Tell me openly and clearly about all the safety measures in place so I'm always in the know. Transparency. We can convert that to formalised assurance criteria where we would then actually look for evidence. That specific evidence are things like that you would typically see as part of checklists for projects to validate whether this project from an assurance perspective is still one that we want to actually invest in, or is still one that we feel that we can trust from a quality perspective. A second example from bias-free decision-making and accountability, prove that AI is fair in its choices. Remember, these are not the voices of academics, industry standard generators, software engineers. This is the voice from everyday people like us when we're not wearing our Dr Elissa Farrow badge. Prove that it's fair and that there are rules and checks in place to make sure that it stays that way, no tricks. And then what would be the evidential position? So again, through this process, what I'm finding so far is that a facilitated process that is genuinely asking a diverse range of voices within an organisational setting or within a community setting, these are some of the broad results that I'm starting to find. Thank you. So with facilitating the process, those user-friendly assurance criteria is actually starting to lift levels of trust. That is gold. Simplifying the language, using more accessible terms, because our world in AI and even project management language is full of jargon. And so actually simplifying language and then allowing end users to actively feel part of and listen to in actually validating AI parameters. These are all results that are coming from the 9 different examples that I've been applying on. Having a user voice and assurance beyond the technical seems to be lifting overall ethical confidence and adoption. So we all know change management starts at the very beginning of a project, or I hope everyone does by now, but it means that this early engagement where we're actually having significant conversations about what do we not want to erode, what do we want AI to provide to us, but how do we know, so that we don't just have the technical experts who are also doing their forms of assurance, but we're also having that validation and understanding from those who potentially have not been in the loop so far. So in closing, broaden the conversation is what my research is demonstrating. Broaden the conversation, bring unique perspectives and diverse needs, and actually listen. So hopefully, as part of our broader concepts in projects of stakeholder engagement, it's a broader definition of that when it comes to thinking who is the person that's going to determine the business requirements, the features, the particular user stories. Let's broaden the circle. Broadening that criteria of what we judge good at is vital for creating AI systems that are essentially robust, sustainable, has been the theme so far this morning, and also capable of meeting diverse user needs. So I'm very happy to share my research. All my doctoral research is published and publicly accessible. My last word though to you guys is something that I've been reflecting on. What would be your top 3 personal assurance criteria for the AI you or your family members use or encounter? So if you put yourself away from the organisational context and put yourself in the context of actually just being a human, a good human, what would be important to you? These are 3 that are important to me. So number 1, ensure that no harm comes to users. Respect the dignity, choice and control of users and that ability to opt out, or at least have that transparency, and validate that the AI solutions we design and install as project managers meet ethical criteria that reflects not just a very narrow definition of interest, but a diverse and broader view. So thank you very much. I'm going to please keep in touch. touch as part of the process, and it's great. Thank you.